Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Mindful Minutes. Today we are talking boundaries. So, are you one of those people who has a hard time setting and establishing boundaries? It's been a challenge for me too, I can honestly say. Well, if you're one of those people, or perhaps maybe you feel like you're being taken advantage of a lot, stay tuned because we're going to talk about 3 helpful ways that you can set, establish, and sustain boundaries in all of your relationships. You are definitely in the right place at the right time right now. Let's get started. So Gerald Manley Hopkins once said, "Your personal boundaries protect the inner core of your right to choices." Now, creating boundaries can be definitely scary and intimidating for a lot of us, especially if you're a people pleaser like me. I'm definitely a people pleaser. I don't like to offend people unintentionally, especially if I'm, just have really good will at heart. So I don't want to unnecessarily have someone feel bad because I'm establishing a boundary. And because of just the way that I like to conduct my relationships, I'm very mindful in how the other person on the receiving end of the relationship feels. So often I've sacrificed boundaries in place of making sure that someone feels comfortable, safe, and trusting with me. However, why should I or you or anybody ever sacrifice boundaries? That's a great question. So let's talk about what boundaries are meant for. How does putting a boundary or setting a boundary in a relationship really impact our lives? So boundaries are definitely necessary in all relationships, working relationships, personal relationships, romantic relationships, family relationships, friendships, whatever kind of relationship is, if there's a relationship component there is a boundary that needs to be set. Now, setting a boundary allows you to set the tone for that relationship. So you're telling that person, this is what I am and am not okay with in this relationship. And when those boundaries are crossed or not respected, then that's when you have to look at the boundary a little bit different way, and as well as the nature of the relationship and what you're trying to achieve or what you're looking for to get out of that relationship. So how does setting boundaries even really impact our daily lives? In a lot of ways, because every day you come across somebody you have a relationship with, right? And that person deserves to know what you do and don't accept as, behavior in a healthy relationship according to your terms and standards. So setting boundaries in any circumstance is absolutely appropriate, and it really does help us better protect ourselves, stand up for ourselves, and show the other person in the relationship that not only are we willing to put down boundaries for ourselves, but also accept their boundaries in return. Because if we are asking somebody else to respect our boundaries, then of course it's only right to respect theirs as well. Poor boundaries can allow the other person in the relationship to think that it's okay to be intrusive, to not respect your privacy, or to possibly do things or say things that you're really not comfortable with. So to avoid any misunderstanding, that's why it's so important to really make sure that you're establishing those boundaries, especially in intimate and personal relationships, because those are the individuals who should be respecting your boundaries the most. A couple of examples of poor boundary setting. A friend or family member who constantly shows up to your house unannounced. Clearly they think that's okay, so a boundary needs to be established. Perhaps your employer asks a lot of personal questions about you. You are not required to reveal those things at work, and obviously there's a boundary that's being crossed because you don't go to work to talk about your personal life, you go to work to do your job, right? So maybe there needs to be a boundary that's established there. Perhaps there's a cousin, aunt, uncle, grandparent who always comes and brings candy to your kids when they visit. Maybe for you, you're not a mom who likes a lot of sugar, or for your kids to eat candy for lots of different reasons or whatever. So there needs to be a boundary established with that relative or whoever they are. There are a lot of different reasons why boundaries need to be established, but those are just a couple of examples on why it's so important for boundaries to be established, because even the simplest, smallest things can be misconstrued as okay if someone doesn't know what the boundary is. If setting boundaries is intimidating for you, just think of it as a way of protecting yourself. You're protecting your values, you're protecting your beliefs, you're protecting your choices, and you're protecting your individual preference. So you absolutely have a justifiable reason, we all do, of why we establish boundaries. Let's talk about how we establish boundaries. There are 3 simple steps that you can take to establish boundaries, and the first step being know your boundaries. You have to know your boundaries and why they're important to you, right? Because if you don't, how are you going to even justify setting them? So that is definitely a good step in the right direction. Number one, know your boundaries. Number two, have that conversation. Regardless of how you may or may not feel comfortable or uncomfortable having a conversation about boundaries, the only fair way to let the other person know that there's a boundary that's needing to be established is to communicate that boundary to them. There are so many ways of doing that in a polite, courteous, friendly, and thoughtful manner. Please don't be afraid to talk to that person about establishing boundaries with that person, because that really also does show them that you respect the relationship enough as a two-way street to come directly to them to speak to them about it, so that they can hear from your mouth how you feel, why, and better understand your needs in the relationship. And to me, that's just kind of also goes along with relationship building, even if it's a professional relationship or just an acquaintance. That person will gain so much more respect out of you when you go to them with the issue or go to them with the topic of conversation and talk to them directly about why you're needing to establish that boundary. Communication is key in establishing boundaries and setting a healthy foundation for any relationship. So, number two, communicate your boundaries. Number three, when all is said and done, if you've taken the proper steps to implement those boundaries and communicate those boundaries, or whatever your resolution was to setting the established boundary, if it's not been received well by the other party in the relationship, or perhaps they're not following the boundary or respecting it, perhaps it's just kind of gone over their head or in one ear and out the other, because that does happen sometimes, then step number three is take a step back and really reevaluate that relationship. If the relationship is suffering because the other person is failing to acknowledge and respect the boundaries that you've set, I think that's when it's a good time to step back and say, is this relationship benefiting me? Is this relationship healthy for me? How can I continue to invest in this relationship if what I'm needing is not being reciprocated? If it's a working relationship, that can get a little bit tricky, just because you don't really want to tell your boss to mind his own business in so many words, right? And sometimes it may be appropriate for HR to get involved. But what you want to make sure you're doing is following your chain of command in requesting that the healthy boundaries be established, even if it is at work. Don't let a work environment intimidate you from speaking up and protecting yourself. So step number three is reevaluate the relationship if those boundaries are not being respected or are being overlooked. Let's revisit 3 steps to setting and sustaining your personal boundaries. Step 1, know your boundaries. Step 2, communicate your boundaries to the other person. Step 3, if the boundaries are being overlooked or are not being respected, definitely take the time to reevaluate the relationship and your expectations of it. Earlier, I mentioned a couple of scenarios of different ways that boundaries can be crossed, and how do we communicate our wishes for those things to change with that other person. Sometimes communication isn't always easy, especially when you just want to find the right words. So for the person who constantly drops into your house unexpectedly, a simple, do you think you can give me a call next time because I was napping, or I don't feel well and this just wasn't a great time, so this time it didn't work out so well. That's a perfect way of saying, hey, you know what, dropping in is great, and sometimes I do want to visit with you and see you unexpectedly. However, it's not working for me, and can you please call? That's an excellent way of setting a polite boundary and also allowing that person to know that while you do care for them to come over, you don't care for it to be unexpectedly. For the individual at work who is just continuing to be asked personal questions over and over by their nosy employer, that's a difficult boundary, but it is an example of one that can be difficult to establish at times. And again, as I said earlier, always know your chain of command and know where to go if the conversation goes left, because you certainly want to protect yourself and your good intention. And for those of you who have that candy happy relative or friend who insists on bringing candies and treats to the kids when they visit, it's certainly appropriate to ask that they think of other alternatives to unhealthy sugars and candies for your children. Absolutely put your children's needs first in that regard. How do we really apply a mindful perspective daily to establishing boundaries? Well, When you think of establishing boundaries as more of a system to protect you, your beliefs, your choices, and your privacy, it's much easier to kind of subconsciously want to always establish those boundaries. So as your day goes along, when things come across your path in different relationships that you're interacting with, when something doesn't really resonate well with you, you're going to start to feel much more comfortable being assertive and establishing that boundary right then and there. So daily mindfulness does apply to establishing boundaries. I hope that you have enjoyed today's episode of the Mindful Minutes as we talked about setting, maintaining, and sustaining boundaries. Healthy boundaries for any relationship, anytime, any day. It certainly helps to be mindful of the boundaries that we set. If you like today's episode, please click that like button. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe to my channel, The Mindful Minutes, so that we can continue to talk about mindfulness, what it means, and how it truly does change our lives. And remember, true mindfulness is a spiritual elevation, not a personal delegation. For those of you who follow me regularly on Instagram at Live Resiliently and on Facebook at Live Resiliently Coaching, you'll know that today was the very first Monday in my new Mindful Mondays segment. I'm so excited. I received amazing feedback throughout the day already. So if you have not yet followed me on Instagram or Facebook, please do so and join me for Mindful Mondays. Now today's topic is super exciting. We are talking about vacation mind. What is it and how can you have it? Tune into Instagram and Facebook to find out. Thanks so much, guys. I will see you on next week's episode of The Mindful Minutes.